bad cyber conflict is getting. Just yesterday, several nations came out and called out Russia for attacks on the nation of Georgia. And so it's easy when you're seeing these to let our pessimism take over. Just this week, the Chief of Naval Operations, the top admiral in the United States, said there are no international norms. And this is a really dangerous thing to say. Because if we're saying there's no norms, well, then we don't really need to restrain ourselves. In fact, if there are no norms, if you restrain your own operation, then you're being a sucker. And the other side isn't just going to win, they're going to run the table. And so we're here in part to talk about, yes, absolutely, some of the bad things that are happening in cyber conflict, but we want to pull that back some and say, no, there are really important things that are happening if we're going to be looking at CyberPeace. And we really couldn't do any better than the panelists we have here. Well, we could do better if Jane Lute was here, but Secretary Lute unfortunately got called back down to the UN for some important areas, and we do miss her, but that gives us more time to talk amongst ourselves. So we will make the most of it. And so to start talking about this, we're going to start with Tom Markram. Now, Tom is really qualified for this because he's spent 16 years now at Office of Disarmament Affairs, as director and deputy to the High Commissioner, if I'm getting that right. And what I like about the panel is we're bringing in people that have expertise in other areas of how humanity and governments have dealt with other issues of this kind. And so Tom was running the nuclear weapons group. He was working on biological weapons. He was saying, what can we do to get chemical weapons out of Syria? And now he's bringing that deep expertise here. We'll move on from him to Chris Harland, who's the legal representative of the Red Cross, the ICRC, to the United States and Canada. And the lead responsibility from that is working with the United Nations, I get. And boy, if you look at Chris's bio, he's worked in New Delhi, he's worked in Kuala Lumpur, he's worked in Geneva. If you look at the really difficult spots where you're glad there are people there from the Red Cross, Angola, Rwanda, Canada. And so really glad that Chris can be here. From the national perspective, right, about what it's like to be in one of these states that's having to go through these problems. You already heard this morning or earlier today from Thomas. Here on our panel from Montenegro, we have Milica Pejanovic-Durisic. And so really, really thrilled. She'd been the ambassador to France from Montenegro. And really importantly for us, the Minister of Defense of Montenegro in a really important time for that country. And if you've been paying attention to the news of the last couple of years, Montenegro has really been at the center, not just on the cybersecurity side, but also on the influence operations. And so really important to hear about that. And lastly, to fill up on the private sector side, Alex Niejelow. So Alex, great background, doing a number of things, including having been at the Obama National Security Council working on cyber issues, but he's now at Mastercard, which has really been front and central on a lot of these issues. Alex was also pushing a couple of really important projects, including one on scholarships. People who want jobs in cybersecurity. But more importantly for this, Mastercard was behind the funding of the CyberPeace Institute, and Alex is on the board. So this private sector institute in Geneva that's there to say what can the private sector do in cooperation with, but separate from governments, and what's the role of CyberPeace for the private sector. So with that, can we please, maybe Tom, you can start us off.
Well, thank you very much, Jason, and very much thank you very much to CIPA for arranging this. Former President Thomas Hillis, great lecture. Glad to have been here and to listen to that. And fellow panelists, ladies and gentlemen, I'm basically just going to give a slight overview of the processes first. As Jason pointed out, I'm not a cyber expert. I'm more involved in other things. But those of you that have been looking at the process for the last couple of years, 2 years ago in 2018, separate draft resolutions of the cyber issue were tabled by the Russian Federation and the United States at the first committee of the General Assembly. So this was the first time that we had broken the traditional consensus that had been held on the Russian cyber resolution, and we established two parallel processes at the UN. The first is a group of governmental experts that comprise of 25 members and chaired by the Ambassador of Brazil, Guilherme Patriota. Groups of governmental experts are basically just a small group that are brought together to try and focus on a particular issue with a view to taking it to a much wider group and to seeing if you can actually move on to norms, move on to sort of legally binding commitments on these things. It's usually a precursor to doing something more concrete on the issue. And the second thing was an open-ended working group which is open to all member states. So this is the first time that all countries in the world will consider how to address global cybersecurity. And that open-ended working group is chaired by Ambassador Niejelow of Switzerland. So both of these groups have been studying and have been developing common understandings between states on 5 central themes: existing and potential threats, how international law applies to the use of ICTs by states, norms, rules, and principles of responsible state behavior by states, confidence building measures, and also capacity building. And the open-ended working group has an additional element in its mandate to take forward regular institutional dialogue on international cybersecurity under the auspices of the United Nations. So both of these groups have built on the work that have been done in 5 previous GGEs. The first one established in 2004, and these 5 have run through to 2017. And 3 of them have produced a substantive outcome where they have studied and made recommendations on the same 5 pillars that I mentioned earlier. So the process in the discussions so far, the first working group took place in September 2019, and the second one just over a week ago. The first GGE had its session in December 2019 and will reconvene again next week in Geneva to continue that work. So at the open-ended working group, states have continued to share their views on international law and how this applies to the use of ICTs, and also to deliberate on whether there's a need for a legally binding instrument in cyberspace. On existing and potential threats, states have been taking stock of how new technological developments such as increasing autonomous cyber operations, cloud computing, blockchain and quantum computing could lead to new threats and also to new vulnerabilities. On norms of responsible state behavior, while some states have felt that the open-ended working group should focus on the full implementation of existing norms, others suggest that new norms may be needed. At the most recent open-ended working group session, norms proposed by some states included the protection of the availability and integrity of the public core of the Internet. Many states have highlighted that more should be done in areas of confidence and capacity building. Proposals put forward in this effect include the possible development of a coordination platform for capacity building and sharing of best practices, as well as a possible mechanism to match states' capacity building needs with resources. Meanwhile, former President Thomas Rivers was pointing out how many of the industrialized countries are dealing with this issue. Many countries, for them it's the first time that they're actually dealing with these issues in a global context, and they have a lot of catch-up to do. So there's a massive backdrop in a lack of capacity in many states. Regarding inclusivity in the UN processes, in the world's interconnectedness in the digital sphere requires trust and openness. And this is something that also former President Ilves touched on earlier today, and I'll come back to that at the end of this talk as well. And this has been fostered. This requires trust and openness that needs to be fostered on many levels and across many relationships. Such trust and transparency is central to promoting an open, secure, accessible, and peaceful ICT environment for everyone. The nature of the challenges confronting us on cybersecurity means that no single government will be able to find an effective solution. While states have the primary responsibility for maintaining a secure and a peaceful ICT environment, the private sector, as well as academia and civil society, also have a central role to play. Both UN processes have included several elements to have a wider consultation with these various sectors, and also to raise more awareness. So we actually had in the Open-Ended Working Group an informal multi-stakeholder meeting in December last year with over 100 states and 114 industry, academia, and civil society stakeholders. And those discussions were extremely helpful to bring attention to new potential threats and also to bring some more innovative proposals to the floor, particularly on taking forward discussions on voluntary and binding norms, as well as more responsible sort of state behavior and doing these things in parallel. There's also been quite an outreach with the GGEs in going to various parts of the world, the African Union, ASEAN, the European Union, to the OIS and the OSCE, so that the whole wider membership has been covered. I mean, looking forward to where we intend to go, I mean, the Open-Ended Working Group will conclude its work in July this year, and the UN GGE will conclude its work in May next year. From the UN's perspective, it's going to be important that both of these groups actually succeed. This will be a particularly strong signal to the international community that progress can be made on this important as well as this challenging topic of ICTs in the international security context, something that you were alerting to earlier, Jason. I mean, a return to a single consensus resolution would be an optimal outcome for both of these processes. While the challenges to agreement on whether a legally binding instrument is required, there have been some promising proposals that have been made. Firstly, the parallel pursuit of both legally binding as well as voluntary measures. And secondly, the possibility of a politically binding approach similar to the Program of Action on the Illicit Trade in Small Arms and Light Weapons, with a regular possibility of review for implementation. If I can, Jason, just to go back to trust for a minute. I mean, the frequency and the severity of ICT incidents, together with the complexity of attributing the source of these incidents, is undermining the trust that is out there and posing significant risks to international peace and security at the moment. As these two intergovernmental processes commence the work, I'm sure it occupies all of our minds on how much trust can be built between states in the digital environment. However, there's also another form of trust central to our digitally driven world. That is the trust between private companies that they must have in their government, and that their government will protect their interests in cyberspace, while also striking the right balance between national security on the one side and privacy, and importantly, freedom to innovate, something that former President Ilves was pointing out to earlier this morning. Such trust lies at the core of the public-private sector cooperation, whether it is in the information sharing, threat analysis, or in the development of policies to solve common ICT-related concerns. Without this, it's going to be a challenge to move forward collectively. And in this context, by collectively, I mean it will involve all relevant actors. Thank you.
And I really like the point on trust, and I suspect we'll come back to that. You know, for ages, I mean, certainly my time in the White House, when we were looking at ICT policy, it was about innovation, it was about economic policy. And now it seems, especially in the United States and other countries, ICT policy is an arm of national security policy. And in innovation and economy, you might not have a surplus of amazing trust, but you've certainly got a lot more than national security people do. I mean, they're some of the most paranoid amongst us, and I speak as a national security person, right? And so it's going to be interesting how that's going to be affecting trust in governance. And just one clarifying question. When I talk to my students, I generally say the UN group of government experts, so it's been going on since, did you say 2004, the first, has tended to be a much smaller group with maybe deeper conversations, and the open-ended working group is meant to be for all member states and civil society to come in so that everyone can feel like they're being heard and have a voice. Is that about right?
It's about right. I mean, there was a lot of talk at the beginning about how these two would actually work closely with each other and what they would actually do. And so the GGE gives them the chance to go more into depth because you've got less people driving on a particular issue, where in a much bigger group, you've got far more voices to be heard in a given point of time. So you're looking at things in a much broader context. But that being said, both of the chairs of these have worked very closely together.
That's great.
They've actually traveled together to all these regions and done a lot of this work together to ensure that there's complementarity between these two processes, and they're not out of sync with each other.
Oh, that's great.
They are delivering the reports at different times, and therefore, while the open-ended working group will deliver their first report, they can at least build on that for the GGE as well.
Oh,
it's not like work that's been lost out there.
That's great. Thank you very much. I've got more questions on that, but I'm gonna hold off because I'm just excited to hear Chris. So I mean, and I think I suspect everybody knows the role of ICRC in this, but if you maybe start us off there. Thanks.
No, thank you very much. Thank you, Jay, and thank you very much to CIPA and Columbia University for the invitation to speak at this forum. Some of the starting questions, in fact, that we would reasonably be asked would be, why is the Red Cross here? What does the Red Cross have to do with war? What's its interest in cyber operations? All very good questions. I'll try to answer them. The ICRC, as some of you will know, began in 1863. It resulted from the aftermath of some 40,000 soldiers lying dead or injured on a field in northern Italy after a battle that lasted about 24 hours, which was in June of 1859. There's a key figure at the origin of the ICRC, a Swiss businessman named Henri Dunant, and he saw what happened. He gathered some villagers together and tried to help those that they could. And he has two questions in a book that he published in 1862. The first was, would it be possible to set up an organization that could help people during war? And the second was, couldn't we have better rules that would govern how war should be fought? The first question that he had led to the creation of the International Committee of the Red Cross in 1863, and then the second became what we know today as the basic rules of war, or how wars are fought, the Law of Armed Conflict, or as we call it, International Humanitarian Law, or IHL. Notably through the first Geneva Convention of 1864, and then now the bedrock of today's IHL, the four Geneva Conventions of 1949. Those conventions in them provide for mandates for the ICRC to act as a neutral, impartial intermediary in times of war. So being able to carry out impartial humanitarian action, to do things like deliver messages to families of those who are captured in war, to speak to all warring parties about what's going right and what's going wrong. And we do so in a confidential, bilateral way, which gives us better access. It wasn't always such. We started off publishing our reports up until about 1927 or so. And then we saw we were losing access to places of dissension because we kept publishing all the bad things we were seeing. And so we changed a little bit how we did things. And that's how we operate today. So we have confidential, bilateral discussions with parties to armed conflict to try to make sure that the rules of law are in fact respected. So what I would do maybe is to touch on both the law of armed conflict itself, what we see in armed conflict today, as it relates to cyber operations, which is the subject today. So I've got 3 points I'd like to touch on. First is about the law of armed conflict as it relates to the protection of essential civilian data. Here, it's perhaps just useful for those. How many of you are familiar with IHL, would you say? Put up your hands if you're familiar. So it's a few, yeah. So the way I describe, I'm from Canada, so I use a hockey reference. But there's whether it is legal to go to war at all. Right? That's the jus ad bellum. The charter covers that. It's not what the ICRC is concerned about. It's sort of like, is it legal to play hockey at all? Which is a good question. The next question is whether you're in a war at a given particular point in time. And you can understand that that's a very different question about whether it's legal to do what you did in terms of going to war. The second question is simply whether there is a war, because under the United Nations Charter, you can have the lawful authorization of war, or you can have an action that would not be legal under the law of armed conflict. Or sorry, under the law of ad bellum, the law, it's the law to war rather than the law in war. So ad bellum is not what we're concerned about. That's the Charter Security Council. in bello, we maintain databases to try to know at any given point in time everywhere in the world whether there is an armed conflict, because it governs how we act, the ICRC, because there are special rules that relate to us in armed conflict. And then, separate question, what are the rules in war? So the second question is, what rules are you playing with on the hockey rink? And then the third is, have you violated a rule? Is it offside? If somebody's got to go to the penalty box? That's the law in war, the use in bello. So three separate things: ad bellum classification of armed conflict, international, non-international, and finally whether it's legal to be in, whether someone has violated the war. So we talk to parties to let them know that they're in a state of war at a given time, and then we talk to them continually, repeatedly, about what we see in our conflict. We do that bilaterally and confidentially. So you can imagine that there could be issues in an armed conflict that could involve cyber, because cyber is being used in armed conflict today. It's a much trickier question about whether or not cyber leads to an armed conflict. In questions, I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that. But I think states are a little bit reluctant to call out an armed conflict in the cyber, because let's say starting in the cyber field. But once you're in an armed conflict, we have seen examples of the use of cyber operations in the midst of an armed conflict, and that's what we've been looking at today. So international, you've got two or more states fighting each other, and non-international, you have the state against armed groups or armed groups amongst each other. So that's just sort of an overall framework of where we, the ICRC, come at it. Of course, Thomas has just set out that there's two fora that are currently discussing this, including issues relating to the how does international law apply in the cyber domain. And one of the issues is there are some states that maybe aren't as comfortable with hearing that international humanitarian law, the law of armed conflict, applies in the cyber domain when you have an armed conflict. But that's one of the things that we're discussing with it. So that's maybe kind of an overview, kind of a why we're concerned by these things. But then we get a little bit into the legal questions. So there are some tough legal questions that IHL poses in this field. The first is, once you have an armed conflict, the rules of targeting, which are governed in Additional Protocol 1 and under customary law, only apply, well, almost all of them, the most important ones, only apply if you've got an attack. So an attack is defined as violence and offense or defense. And is a cyber operation mounted through networks, is that violence in offense or defense under Article 49 of AP1 or not? So that's one question. It's just the word attack. Very different from armed attack under the Article 51, for example, of the Security Council. Different than the expression armed conflict. It's the word attack. So that's one question. We've moved to look at effects, and so we think it can be covered by it. But once you have attack apply, then you have, when you carry out attacks, you've got to distinguish between civilian objects and military objectives, for example. Well, the next question, is data an object? Right? If data is not an object, it's hard to find words in the law of armed conflict that would protect it, because protections are given to people and to things. If data is not a thing, then the protections are much more difficult. But when we look at the object and purpose, which is one of the ways that you interpret treaties, in the additional protocols, for example, and in the Geneva Conventions, you're looking to protect things that relate to people, for example. And we think that things like medical records are worth protecting and are important to protect in armed conflict. So we lean towards the find a way to protect data, either as an object or otherwise, as being extremely important. A related question is, under the proportionality rule, you have to balance the anticipated military advantage you're going to gain against the expected civilian loss. And the loss includes damage to civilian objects. So assuming data is an object, is loss of functionality of that data, is that also something that is damage and therefore needs to be considered in carrying out an attack in armed conflict? And these are difficult legal decisions or questions which commanders who are operating in armed conflict today need to bear in mind. But we are looking, our goal is to try to seek to find ways to ensure that civilian data is in fact protected. So that's the first thing I just wanted to mention, some of the legal issues that arise.
And can I take a pause on there before we move on? And I like this because it's a really important point. When we first got into this business, and still when I hear someone that's coming in, they say, is cyber an attack an act of war? Or is cyber attack an attack or an armed attack in these ways? And I like what Chris did here, because he said that the actual question is under what conditions, or something like some kind of reframing, not is it, because then you're in this black and white, and then you've got all sorts of edge cases that you can look at, versus under what conditions might it be, and both in the effects and the target. And so I think that's a really important point, especially as people are coming in new to the field. So great, thanks, Chris.
Thanks. The second point is just we're concerned with vulnerabilities that currently exist with civilian objects in armed conflict. We had a group of experts meeting about a year and a bit ago, and we were expecting to hear that the real pressure points are going to be things that could cause a massive emergency, such as the release of hazardous materials as a result of an attack that would be cyber in nature on, let's say, nuclear power stations. But what we found was, probably in terms of what would cause the greatest civilian harm, was vulnerabilities in the healthcare sector. That, in particular, is moving towards increased digitization currently and interconnectivity, but the sort of what's called the attack surface hasn't been matched by a corresponding improvement in cybersecurity, and so we see a lot of vulnerabilities there. That infrastructure is particularly vulnerable, and of course has, you can imagine, potentially serious consequences for health and life. We note as well that industrial control systems, on the other hand, they're protected by complex safety mechanisms, so they have built-in redundancies, they're slightly better protected.
So these are the computer systems that are maybe protecting pipelines or factories, or I'm not protecting, but are operating pipelines or factories or electrical
networks,
grid.
for example, there's a number of different things, and they have built-in redundancies to guarantee safety and reliability. So electrical networks with grids have multiple power sources to avoid widespread effects when one of their parts is affected. But nevertheless, attacks on specific nodes might cause significant impact. So if there's a critical system, such as a water supply, which is important, of course, in cities where most wars are being fought these days, or a hospital, depends on a specific subsystem or node, or because they have cascading harmful consequences that even though they have redundancies built in, they are susceptible to damage, causing a lot of civilian harm. We have published a report last year. It's called The Potential Human Cost of Cyber Operations. It's available on the web. And that's what we see currently as some of the most important things for policymakers and those acting in the cyber field to bear in mind. And the third point, and perhaps relevance not only for this one but for the next one, is that we've been doing a lot of soul searching ourselves as the ICRC to try to find ways that we can try to better protect civilians through our actions. Because you can imagine, because we operate in 80 contexts around the world, almost anywhere there's a war, we're there. We collect information on beneficiaries because we want to help them. We visit people who are in detention for security reasons. We go to facilities that house upwards of 1 million people around the world every year. So it's something that we're quite involved in. And so data is very, very important to us. And one of the things that we've seen recently is an increase in the use of biometric data. So we've recently published our internal reflections on guidelines that will determine how we collect and transfer data. So we've gone through that. We're now actually applying it in the field, and each time you have a new policy you apply it in the field, you get a lot of interesting questions that come up. And so I would say that there are challenges with that. I probably can't go much into detail about how we're doing this in practice. But I can say that there is a policy available, and we've made it public because we're hoping that other organizations, the United Nations and others, reflect on how best to deal with biometrics in particular, but data protection more generally. And that policy, of course, relates to the exclusively humanitarian work of the ICRC, and it creates restrictions on how we share and transfer biometric data with states or other authorities. For example, with non-state armed groups where we operate. Additionally, we set out the rights of the data subject and procedures for handling requests and objections that would exist concerning biometric data and processing. So, thanks very much. Those are the 3 points.
Yeah. Wow. And in your point on most wars are being fought in cities today, which I want a panel just to talk about that. But when you think about normal warfare in cities, citizens generally are going to get out of the way, right? The innocent individuals, if they can, are going to say, let me get out of here. And one of the things that is different about cyber conflict is that it is fought largely in and through civilian networks, right? When they are often, not quite always, the direct object of attack. They might be dual use, but, and even when the US or French or Russian or Chinese espionage or military units are operating, they're operating and taking over computers that are someone else's private property. And so it's a very, I think, a fundamental different, and I think that's one of the things that we'll come back to is what is it about cyber that is different in important ways? And I think this is one of them in the role of the private sector and individuals in it. But let's hold that point. Ambassador, so I mean, this has been here, and so you're, that's why I'm so glad you're on the panel, because you're able to bring in your UN experience about being part of this, but also having been Minister of Defense, and also I missed an especially cool point, a PhD in computer science, so really able to come in as an engineering yeah, I'm hearing the wow, right? I mean, yeah, this is a wow panel that we've got, of really being able to bring in additional background that not a lot of other ambassadors can, so please.
Well, I hope so. Thank you, first of all, Colombia CIPA, Niejelow, thank you very much for inviting me for this, as I do hope, also interesting panel for our audience today. This is a topic we are discussing quite a lot in the last years. I'm not sure that we are advancing that much. Since actually the issue and the topic is of that kind. Unfortunately, those who are having certain malicious intentions are always a kind of step ahead. And then the others are running behind, trying to somehow do contingency things and try to minimize the possible negative impacts. Anyway, as Jay said, I'm really having quite an interesting expertise and experience. So I've got my PhD in wireless communications at the time when here in US, AT&T Bell Labs were doing the first test on cellular mobile communications. So from that time on, I've been mentoring, I don't know how many PhD students and everything in telecommunications engineering. And I remember, even at the time when this wasn't a kind of a hot topic, when I would be faced with ambitious, innovative student coming to me with a new idea how we'll get to the next level of quality performance indicators for the wireless network, where we are bringing more and more signal processing, more software, I would stop him saying, let's think about this other way around. If we do that, what we are missing out in the sense of, it's communication. It's got to be private in the first place. So somehow you've got to have awareness about the issue we are dealing with. And that is something we are trying to do right at this moment in UN. I agree that there was a process before who was in the, and still is in the group of governmental experts, but somehow, maybe because it's a small group, the outreach of that work wasn't as we expected, the countries which weren't in. And I believe that the wider environment wasn't that much aware of the work which was done there. So once we got this opportunity to be all countries, so 193, involved in this work, we really welcomed that, as Montenegro and me personally. On the other side, it was partially because as a country, and again, as myself, we did have and still are having quite a nice experience with everything which might be related with different cyber attacks. There, you know, you do have different vocabulary, different terms, different classifications. For example, saying that what is the most spread of those different malicious cyber activities nowadays is related with this misinformation, disinformation. Then we say, well, it's not a kind of cyber attack, it's information operation. Okay, at the level of terms, but what are the consequences? Fortunately enough, still we didn't have any consequences which caused loss of human lives or something like that, which is very important. But having activities which at the end are having as a target to provoke all kind of political polarization among the people, to undermine the values of our democratic societies, to put under the question all kind of human freedoms, human rights, economic freedoms, is something which not in that much long term could be transformed in much more serious consequences. So we shouldn't be taking that easily as well. And in that sense, what I am meaning is that actually you do know that Montenegro is, I would say, the youngest NATO member. I do hope that North Macedonia will become shortly the member, so we won't be the youngest anymore. But in this period, while we were working on preparing ourselves for NATO membership, we were really a target of a great number of cyber activities, which were, of course, of denial of service attacks, a lot of them. So the ones which were tending to block government operations in the first place, and then all these kind of disinformation, which are still today on the way. For example, after I finished my term as the Minister of Defense, with some of my colleagues, we established in Montenegro a Digital Forensic Center because we were aware of what was happening and what might be happening further in future. And since we are at this very moment having one, I would say, potentially challenging situation in Montenegro, which is related with new law on religious freedoms, which has been adopted by our parliament in a certain part of the population which is concerned with certain solutions which are in this law, we've been again exposed to those cyber activities. And we counted that, say, in the last 3 months, there have been something like 40,000 different media texts, announcements, which were targeting to further on deepen this certain level of conflict we are having in our society. And unfortunately, somehow all these things could be linked with one address, the only one which was present around even at the time when we were doing all this preparation for NATO membership, and which were actually somehow initiated in a way to undermine NATO's alliance and NATO criteria to allow a country like Montenegro to become a member, because there are some who are thinking that Montenegro might not be a credible and reliable partner. So these are all the elements why we are very active in the open-ended working group, where actually we are trying to work with other countries to come to the point where those necessary instruments for CyberPeace could be established. So there are some preconditions to come to that point, which are of course related with each nation responsibility to do the necessary when it comes to building its own infrastructure. So it's got to be built, and the architecture should be chosen in a way to enable high level of security and resilience, and also backup in the sense something happens. On the other side, I also do believe that we should all be thinking about certain deterrence measures. It always works still. I know it's old-fashioned, but still it works. But then, in the next step, we've got to come to some kind of convention and treaty. And that is the point where we are having a certain challenge in UN because of the countries which I think that it touch up in their national sovereignty. Some of them also, I'm free to say here, some of them also just don't want to let themselves being in a position not being able to use themselves some of these, I would say, activities also. So different reasons there, but I'm very happy to say what I noticed. We did have already 2 substantial sessions, and we have one informal session, which was the historic one in December, because of its multi-stakeholder forum. So something like that never happened in UN. We did have a full room of people from private sector who came to speak with the states about the issue. So that was also a fantastic discussion we had. And I'm very much encouraged through this period we've been working on that, because countries are showing that the level of awareness is there, of course. The level of urgency also. So they are starting to address what they think are the gaps first in awareness of the importance of norms, and then asking for some kind of assistance in operationalization of what we already have, and certain explanations as well. So I think that is a kind of a first phase we are somehow approaching to some more substantial discussions about something which might have an element of a binding treaty. We also, there are some first elements and some first signs, so we've got to be patient, but I do think that the momentum is right. On the other side as well, we are talking a lot about confidence building measures and capacity building measures. Personally, myself, I do think everything is linked. So
You do think?
yeah, I think it's everything is linked. So if we are talking, I mean, now I'm talking like a professor, but if we are talking about capacity building...
Nothing wrong with that.
No, I just need to stress which head I'm using at a certain point. So if we are doing capacity building as such, through these small initiatives, which will be inclusive, which will be oriented towards tangible results, you are building confidence. By building confidence, you are coming to a point where we could more easily talk about the certain norms, red lines, and things like that. So from that point, I'm also usually putting forward the experience, for example, at the regional level in different parts of Europe. We are having with these CIR teams of computer incident response teams, which are operating at a really high level of collaboration, sharing their practicing, sharing good stories and failures. And that's the way how the curve of learning is working on. And these are the things, personally, I'm working at the moment, trying with the other colleagues to get to the point where we will have in July a report with some positive marks there. And another thing we just crossed my mind right this moment is that, for example, last week we did have that second substantial session, which lasted for almost the whole week. And what I noticed being there was a huge number, or I would say the clear majority of young female experts who filled the room. And in their statements, it was always a very clear message with the objectives, way, and targets. So that is the kind of encouragement I got last week.
That is great. And actually, one of my students had recently graduated, and he was there representing his nation, and it was great to see someone right out of SIPA and taking what they learned here and immediately being part of these great conversations. That's great, thank you. Wonderful. Well, that's great to hear. Okay, and I like that you used a word that's very important to many of us, including the Internet Society, who is live casting this for us. Thank you very much, Internet Society. Use the word multi-stakeholder. Of saying not just governments. This isn't an international issue. It is a global issue because it is not just the nations that have an important voice here. It is civil society. It's the corporations that are building and maintaining this. And so we're really glad that batting cleanup. Sorry, I had to switch American to a baseball analogy there. To Alex Niejelow, because you've been in this both on the government side and now Mastercard, I think, has been playing a really important role in this. So maybe you can finish us out here, and then we'll probably go to questions.
That'd be great. So once again, phenomenal group, and
yeah, right.
I think the shared perspective and ideas that each bring is exactly why I'm so proud of what SIPA is doing, and the collaborative nature of it. I think there was one word, and unfortunately. Thomas stole it from me and a decent portion of my prepared remarks, but that's a good thing, is trust, right? Foundationally, our technology issues and the power of the internet, of what it has done in the last 30 plus years specifically, and particularly in the last 15, has affected, mostly for good, every facet of our lives, how we live it. There's inordinate power and opportunity that comes from that, from innovation, from shared societal experiences and engagement. There's also a serious concern on the diminishing elements of trust in technology, in corporations, and in democratic institutions in particular, for the reasons that Chris was speaking to, and Thomas and Ambassador, the asymmetric nature of cyber threat actors and capabilities is fundamentally flipping the power of the internet and digital economy on its head, not for good. The massive number, and I think there's a broader thread too, on what John's going to talk about shortly on data flows. I think to your point, this all does fit together. Digital identity coming up as more people, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and around the world, come online. The ability to have an identity as an individual, it's a human right, and interact is at question. And so we, with Microsoft and the Hewlett Foundation, came together recently and launched the CyberPeace Institute, aptly named, I think. Lofty, perhaps, in title, but the right idea. And it's really centered around, and it's in Geneva, as Chris knows. It's centered around three core functions that are getting fleshed out and worked out currently. The first is assistance, to vulnerable populations and communities that can range from NGOs to civil society to perhaps Georgian network news information being attacked by a state actor. What we're looking to do is not replicate the great work of many of the NGOs, civil society, research institutions, etc., but rather to act as, with the resources of some pretty decent-sized companies and foundations, to help actually begin to connect the dots and take the asymmetry out of the equation, or at least mitigate it. So we now have, I think, 42 different entities that have joined the Cyber Volunteer network that will be stood up, that can help respond to events as they occur. This is not going to be the the guys and gals in blue helmets parachuting in, but it certainly is, nor do I think anyone wants it to be. But what it can do is act as an enabler of tools, resources that many of these institutions have brought to bear. Second is around accountability. That word was purposely chosen short of the word attribution. The idea there, I think for the point that Chris was making around or Jay led into around attribution issues and the challenges typically in the realm of governments who have that responsibility. And there are a variety of reasons that there can be reluctance by governments to fully come forward, either because of challenges in supporting and the complexity of how cyber operations are carried out, and to Jay's point earlier of the utilization of civilian infrastructure, just because it looks like it's coming from somewhere doesn't necessarily mean that it really is. But the idea on the advancement, excuse me, I just gave away the third, but accountability side is to help bring together the different technical groups, research institutions that are doing phenomenal work and get about 85% of the way there, where it's abundantly clear, based on the technical indicators and the nature of the techniques, procedures that are used, that we know who the bad actor is without having to outright name X country. Does two things. One, takes a little bit of the risk out of the equation for others to come forward and name, and secondly, by identifying the manner in which the cyber threat actors are carrying out the cyber attacks and bad acts, is it helps take or at least reduce that vehicle that they're using or method off the table, and make it a little bit more challenging again. Back to reducing the asymmetric advantage that the bad guys currently have right now.
And Alex, and how does the institute decide? All right, this is a particular, this incident is one that we have to give attention to, right? And we heard from, Chris and Markram, Chris and Tom of talking about, international armed conflict. Things that cross a particular line. And is that going to be tied in with law? Is it just going to be something that was particularly egregious that the institute thinks? Does it get nominated by nation states or others?
Both.
Okay.
So I wouldn't say it's definitely not going to be nominated by nation states, but as the events occur, and candidly, the institute was just stood up, and we had our first board meeting in Geneva last week. So a lot of elements are being continually fleshed out. So I want to be transparent on the work that's occurring there. But on the types of events and the population, it's not going to be situations in which we're supporting a government that has an event occur to it outright. It's going to be about vulnerable communities that are affected by this. The last one is advancement, which is centered around both norms, as everyone's spoken to, and in the traditional sense, but also, and I think more importantly, this goes to the business side of this, is we have the benefit of not having to wait till there is a treaty to advocate and bring forward views on, as these attacks occur, where there are gaps in a belief set that is affecting society and our businesses. And we have that power and benefit. Having been in government, always thought the government had all the power, right? There's a really, really strong opportunity for companies and groups that are of like mind, that believe in these issues and advancing them, that they can go forward and push that. And we're putting our money where our mouth is, quite literally. And so I add to that, on the advancement piece, we are looking at not only the acts of governments in the traditional norm sense, but we believe that there's responsibilities of the private sector itself, how we manage data, how we protect identity, how we provide privacy, how we believe. This is all foundational, again, back to the institutions and societal impact that we're concerned over right now.
Yeah, and things like the Digital Tech Accord, I think, fit in that also, and the responsibilities of companies. And so I'm going to coin the word. So if you want to attribute, but you don't want to go all the way to attribute, then you attribute. If you're getting it almost all the way there. So that's hashtag attribute. For those of you that are tweeting. Okay, and so I'm going to hold off on my questions, which really frustrates me, but I really want to hear what the questions are from the audience. And so I've got one here, I've got one, let's start here, and then we'll go across. Let's wait for the mic, which is coming up from Danielle, our research assistant. Thank you, Danielle.
Hello. Hi, thank you so much for a great panel presentation. So my question was about the confidence and capacity building. And I was thinking about Philip Alston's report in 2018 on the United States, where he talks about, I think he was focusing on coordinated entry in LA for homeless housing, but he was talking about how the poorest of the poor are testing grounds for predictive analytics and like kind of algorithmic injustice. And I guess my question is that I see a lot of cross-collaboration between the private sector, academia, and things like the UN, but how are we going to create processes as we're heading into this new era of digital governance that include the voices and the experience of people who are really on the forefront through vis-a-vis like incarceration, extreme poverty, in these structures as we're reimagining it to think of new governance?
Yeah, and it's a tough one for us because this has largely been an international space, and looking at disarmament affairs, international. I mean, these are very much looking at the issues of war, and so do we have much experience? Actually, maybe Alex, because Mastercard is in this space, it has a foot in both of these spaces.
It's a great question. I wish more people were asking questions like that and thinking about it in those terms of the role that underserved communities deserve correctly. So let me just give one little example. You raised LA, its neighbor San Jose that we're working with. We started something called City Key. The idea is to help create digital identity elements for an actual physical identity for homeless individuals. With that, it would also, that's just a human thing to have identity, and it matters. Think about that dynamic in particular. Secondly, because we're the company that we are and the role that we play, we attach social benefit components to it. So, provides money from the government to individuals who provide different, typically government services, whether it's putting up road signs, whatever it may be. Directly onto the card and to the identity. Takes some of the risk out of the equation and concerns that I think people would both partly rightly as well as unfairly about handing money over to someone like that. This provides that resource and also empowers folks. That's just one little example at the local level that I think is pretty interesting.
And I think especially if I hope you'll be able to stay the afternoon, and I think the second panel this afternoon will especially be getting closer to those issues on that really important question. I'm going to go here, and then your hand up, or no? Okay. And here, and then I'm also going to take JM right after. I'll take the question at the same time.
My name is Vipin from DLT.NYC. My question is very simple. It is, I don't know whether you've seen a movie called Escape from New York back in
Snake Plissken.
back in the 90s. But basically, New York.
Born.
Yeah. Well, I was definitely born. So basically, the question is, you all have identified, and many people have identified specifically, the attribution question and other questions have identified specific places where the threats originate. And if you do a heat map of that threat origination, then you can see where it originates from. So we do a reverse of a Great Wall of China, a cyber moat across these nations where these threats are originating from. So unless you clean up your act you don't get to participate in global. So was there ever such ideas floated? I'm not saying like you should just block it, but you know.
Yeah, and I love the lead in on the movie, and I'm going to touch that point in the second. And so, Alex, from the White House perspective, did we think about that? And
The prior White House.
yeah.
Tom. So I think the example, I wish I had staged you for that question, so thank you. But so we developed under the Obama administration and created the cyber sanctions regime. And that was directly focused on 5 different areas, including malicious cyber behavior. And the idea, just to paint one example of it, of the 5th category, was around the theft of trade secrets for economic advantage, not for espionage, so that some country's airplane fighter could fight better against the competitor, but for economic gain. The power of the sanctions regime that it lent itself to was these guys aren't hacking the companies and places just to show what great hackers they are, just stealing trade secrets. They're doing it for an economic objective. And so to take the economic opportunity out of the equation by reducing access to the financial or economic and trade space was a very powerful incentive to cut it out. Has it done it perfectly? No. Has it done it a heck of a lot? Yes.
And interesting, on this idea, it's a little bit different idea, but the recent book by Rob Kanaki and Richard Clark talked about a digital Schengen and saying maybe the nations that have the same norms and similar norms and do agree and decide, you know what, the countries that are authoritarian, we don't have to necessarily connect to them. We can do this in a different way. Now, that's different from cybersecurity necessarily. It's getting into content in other areas. I don't know, does anyone want to touch on? Okay, and let's take the next one, which was Jam.
Hi, J.M. Porup, cybersecurity reporter here in New York. I'm deeply concerned by the blurring between military action and espionage on the cyber domain. One of the key elements of the Geneva Convention is you wear a uniform, you use a legal weapon, and you are treated with all the protections of the Geneva Convention. And if you're not, you're an illegal combatant with no protections whatsoever. I heard a half-serious proposal a few years ago that, if the U.S. hacks somebody, there should be a screen that pops up that says, you just got hacked by the U.S. Army. I mean, it was half in jest. But how do we act in conformance with those foundational principles of uniformed armed conflict on the cyber domain?
Chris.
Yeah, thanks. Those are really good questions. And there's a number of groups and institutions that have been trying to work on, I think you're getting a little bit of perfidy. Perfidy is illegal under international humanitarian law, and it becomes a crime when you kill or capture or injure someone as a result of it. So if you look at something called the Talon Manual that Mike Schmidt and others have been involved in at the Center of Excellence, NATO, it's one set of attempts to sort of understand the law in the area. They've looked at something like a digital Red Cross packet where certain messages might get certain forms of protection. They've looked at questions relating to neutrality of internet streams and what type of rules do you need to set up in order that you comply with traditional rules of war in this setting, which is quite, there are some specificities that make it quite difficult. I don't think we're at the point where we have unanimity. Even if you can agree, for example, among NATO member states, what this is, when you start to talk to the Russias and Chinas and other states of the world, you start to run into some, I think, some real questions. And so, we of course have been at a number of the meetings in the UN context, and I'm not sure if we're going to get to a place where we'll get common understandings on how these rules need to apply among all of the countries in the world, but I think it's important to try anyway. So I don't have a good answer for that, but I think just to say that there are a lot of people working on it, and there are some ideas of what it would look like. If you took the Talon manual, you could probably design something like a treaty that would then sort of take the existing rules and apply it. But other states will say, yeah, I don't like those rules, I might try to find something else. Even on matters of sovereignty now, there's debate. So yeah, it's an area where if you're a CIPA student, there's a lot of work in the area, I think, to come.
And and certainly within, I would say, Washington, D.C., the conversation is entirely about domestic authorities to conduct the activity, not any responsibilities vis-a-vis the international community or IHL on that issue. And by the way, the thing I meant to mention on the escape from New York is we're not officially announcing it yet, so but everything is looking good for us to be having our Columbia University Hacker Film Festival later this year. Because there's so much mystery and things about this. You see the evil hacker with their hoodie. We do have those. I've got like 8. But we said we want to try and demystify that, of demystifying the idea of hacking and the hacker as society becomes more technological. The idea of the person who is able to use that technology to understand it, that's able to work at their own purpose rather than the purpose that was given it to them. Can be the hero or the anti-hero. And so we want to explore that through film and digital storytelling, and that's a partnership with CIPA and the Columbia University School of the Arts. And so hopefully, fingers crossed, we're going to be having that tour in the fall. So next questions. I've got here and then in front. Yep, okay. Hi.
We can hear you.
No, well, we've got, no, well, if we can, we should, because we've got people that are following online.
Oh, it's on now. Great.
Okay, good.
Hi, my name's Maggie Jack. I'm from the Information Science Department at Cornell Tech. This is a really great set of conversations. My question was mostly for Chris. I'm really intrigued by this idea of international humanitarian law and how it might be able to be used and enforced. I think it's still so new, and we haven't seen so many examples yet. But one thing that I'm particularly interested in is if you think there's any potential for international humanitarian law to be used for disinformation campaigns, particularly against humanitarian workers. So there's been the very big disinformation campaign against the White Helmet group in Syria. So is there any way that we could use this law to combat that? And if so, how would it be enforced? This might be speculative, but I'd love your thoughts about it.
Thanks, yeah. So actually one interesting thing about IHL is there's a difference between ruses on the one hand, which are permitted, and perfidy on the others that is not. And the key difference is what you're trying to do, let's say the misinformation you will engage in, does it have either as its intended consequence or it's expected that it would lead to a loss of trust or confidence in the rules themselves. So for example, you can't put on a Red Cross uniform and start picking up a gun and shooting at people because it leads to a mistrust in the ability, the protective effect of the emblem, which is where you go to get medical treatment when you are in armed conflict. Similarly, if you wave a white flag, so sometimes called a flag of truce, it's not to say I surrender, it's say I want to talk. But then you start shooting at people as you wave the white flag, that is forbidden. It's not forbidden to go on a radio on a public source and say, we've got 100,000 soldiers behind us that are going to get you if you fight us. That's permitted. But misinformation which invites the other party to believe something that isn't true, that it relates in some way to a protective regime in IHL is forbidden. So I would separate those two. And I'd say the rules apply. So if you could imagine that in cyber you did something to invite the confidence of a party to do something in a way under the rules of war, which then you use against either civilians or persons who are protected in armed conflict, or even a soldier, with the examples I said, for example, of the use of a Red Cross or a flag of truce, or cultural property, or works or installations containing dangerous forces, or civil defense organizations. If you've got protected classes in armed conflict, if you misuse those, you're going to violate the laws of war. Those are already understood to be war crimes in most countries of the world. There's international jurisdictions that are applying these rules have applied misuse not in the cyber domain, but I would start with an analogy between the existing rules on ruses and perfidy and try to apply them in the IHL sphere. In the cyber domain. I'm not saying it's easy, but I think that's a starting point.
Is that only applicable during international armed conflict?
Or non-international, both.
Okay, yep.
But it has to be armed conflict.
Correct. These are
Yeah.
rules applicable in armed conflict.
Which is a high bar.
You'll have other regimes that apply.
Now let me just ask for the ambassador and Tom, has there been pressure in the open-ended working group and at the General Assembly and other places to start bringing in the disinformation and looking at these other areas? I know there was speaking some to that, but maybe we can put a little bit finer point on it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Basically, the categories are divided into two. The first is this misuse or manipulation of information which undermines institutions, undermines public trust, and the integrity of political processes. And the second one is what we've been talking most of the time about cyber attacks that undermines and damages critical infrastructure and things like that. So definitely it is a discussion out there. It is a discussion that has risen well, I think the ambassador can probably add some more to it, but it is definitely one of the large components that needs to be addressed in this. How we will actually come to a conclusion at the end of the day, we will see, but it is definitely one of the big topics under discussion.
And with that, okay, yeah, Ambassador, do you have anything to add?
Well, it is, but I would say that it is a topic which is just emerging as a topic in UN. So probably you are all aware that UN is not of these systems who are having very fast reactions. So we will need some time for that. But again, I count on this momentum we are having in the group, which is a little bit putting the things in faster, I would say, processing further on. So I believe we will be having a chance to talk about that even more. What we are talking a lot nowadays, and we didn't touch upon on this particular panel, and I don't know whether we should have been, is that issue also of security, which is in cybersecurity, which is going to be even more important, I think, with all these changes in technologies we are having these days. I mean, first rollouts of 5G are already on the way. It's happening. The security challenges there are completely different of everything we've known up to now. So I do know that academic community is working on these issues, that the private sector is also trying to find its ways, but I'm not sure that the government, part of some sidelines discussions are really involved in that, particularly in this atmosphere where we are having clear disagreements about the providers of the equipment, which is not adding to this very important component of trust building as well. So it is another challenge we are having right at this moment, and it's an issue how we might be handling it, and maybe the academic community would push a little bit towards the others to waken up and to see how we could be going further, since really that technology which is going to be implemented not in the first phase of the 5G rollout, but in the next phases, you do know these systems are evolving all the time, is something which is having so many vulnerabilities.
And one additional, if I can just add on to the answer, something that actually Thomas Ilves and I wrote about a couple of years ago was within NATO. So we couldn't, disinformation or interfering with an election is clearly not, or wouldn't clearly rise to Article 5 of NATO, which is the collective defense clause. But we wrote certainly for an Article 4 to say this is a consultation among the NATO allies that an external force is trying to mess with our elections, which is the center, if you're a democracy, of how you do things. And I'm a little disappointed that we haven't seen an Article 4 yet, because it is one of the solutions. We'll go here, and then we'll go to Wani. Are you? Yep. Yep.
Thank you. I'm David Kirkpatrick. I'm a tech journalist at Techonomy. And I really enjoy and appreciate the general tone of optimism in this, and I'm surprised, to be honest, especially considering that, as I understand it, Russia has a major role in the open-ended working group, and nobody's really talked about that. well, anyway, is that not the case? That they have a pretty major role?
Is the case.
They do. He's nodding and you're shaking your head. Well, whatever. The question I have, it just could have been in that direction, is more, given that there are a growing number of nations that are actively using disinformation either for the current government to have gained power or to retain power, how, and we could name 15 countries, except one of them at least major one in NATO, that are doing that actively right now. Turkey, how is that affecting the ability to get to some kind of global consensus on these issues? Because in my intuitive feeling is it has to be a serious negative.
You want that?
I mean, I'm not involved in maybe we can, and I know the OEWJ isn't necessarily on the disinformation as we just discussed. Are we seeing this big tension between, help me out. I mean, how can we, I know you don't want to talk specifically about member states, so I'm trying to frame this in a way that's...
I can just add that the open-ended working group... I'm trying to make money, I'm not saying anything. I mean, the open-ended working group was created as a result of a Russian resolution, and this is the split that I was talking about. Prior to that, you had a joint resolution where the Americans and the Russians got together and they did the GGEs together. And now you had the Russians coming with the open-ended working group. Part of the premise was to make it more democratic, more transparent. And then the GGEs is basically still running under an American resolution, which is trying to focus more on some of the things that still need to be taken a lot further in depth. And as I say, the challenge has between two chairs is to try and bring complementarity into that process. But the issue that you're bringing up is an issue that is being discussed. As the Ambassador says, we're still in early days in this discussion. This open-ended working group is probably going to go on. I mean, it'll end next year, but already there seems to be enough interest and enough drive in the system for us to see that this will become far more institutionalized, perhaps. And I mean, we're hoping that the GGE report will also bring out things that can be helpful to that open-ended group. If it's finishing after this open-ended working group, so it has the opportunity to actually go a little bit further. But I think the open-ended working group is probably yet to stay for a little bit longer. I mean, there's so much interest in this, and the point that Ambassador was making earlier about capacity building, whereas many of these states are at the forefront of this stuff, much of the world has been left behind by this issue, and for the first time they're now in an international sort of forum, being able to try and catch up, understand what the issues are, and perceiving for the first time a lot of the gaps that they have in their own systems and the vulnerabilities that they're probably facing that they've never even thought about.
And if I can qualify the optimism, I don't know if you were going to jump in, Ambassador, but if I can qualify the optimism, absolutely stuff's falling apart, right? I mean, we see, like in my introductory remarks, right? I mean, there is no doubt that the pace, aggression, the audacity of cyber incidents, with disinformation layered as an evil mayonnaise on that sandwich, it's just getting, I mean, there's no doubt there's plenty of room for pessimism. And what I like, as someone that's been in this for decades, is as you're seeing the mechanisms of governance and decision-making catching up to where we are, I don't know if I go so far as to catching up to how bad things are, but at least starting to get themselves together. I mean, at least you're now having people saying, like, more people saying we need to get together, more people at more senior levels coming together that are understanding this, more people with different backgrounds. It used to be if we would have been having this conversation 10 years, when we had this conversation 10 years ago, it was largely the technologists, a few diplomats that kind of knew what was going on, Michelle Markov, Chris Painter in the US, among others. And now we're broadening that out. And so that, I think, for me, is where that guided optimism is coming from.
Additionally, we are now having governments who are appointing cyber ambassadors, people who are dedicated to this kind of work, so things are really changing. And when it comes to NATO, you know as well that NATO did updated its policies and its operational domains, adding cyber as additional one to the 3 previous at the time, and established a cyber command. So, of course, serious work is there on the way to define the things we were talking about. They do need also some kind of agreed norms to have the real actions in a specific situations. For the time being, they are more, of course, focused on what are the physical things, physical infrastructure and things like that, and probably not being aware or being in some kind convinced that this kind of, at this level, I mean, of disinformation, misinformation can't cause the real harm to what is the physical part of our world or the human lives. That is somewhere which is not perceived as a direct consequence. And we do hope all that we won't have that chance to have that kind of a direct consequence. But what I'm arguing for is to be always ready for the worst case scenarios. So probably that needs some time.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I'm not going to come over here. I've been one person waiting over here. This will be the last question. Wani.
Good afternoon. My name is Wani Kim. I'm a second-year MIA student here at CEPA, studying international security policy. My original question was really about how effective you thought that norms being developed at the UN would be in the guiding behavior of the nation states and the member states, namely because without a credible enforcement mechanism and attribution of these activities, like how would you be able to deter these violations? Well, I think we've spoken at length about that, so if you'd like to take up more on it, please do. But I suppose I'll ask a fun question, if you will. In Russian doctrine, they generally delineate between information warfare between the psychological and the technological aspects of it. Whether you're attacking the cyber infrastructure or whether or not you're attacking the psychological aspects of a target audience. From your perspectives, then, do you think that the conversations at the UN and the various governing bodies are properly accounting for the disinformation attacks that have been discussed here, and as well as delineating between the efficacies of these campaigns on psychology, as well as the technical aspects that are being addressed by existing humanitarian law? Thank you.
That was the easy, fun question.
Yeah, I know. Yay! I want to party with you, man. That's and so I'm gonna open up to both of those, because on one hand I do think through the psychological, we have talked about the disinformation, which I think is I think we have covered part of that fun. Yay! And on the I'm going to take up the first question a little bit, because not just enforceable norms, but something that only got brought up a couple of times. Which was an actual binding treaty that came up. And it really struck me in Tom's first points when you said, the existing threats, the international humanitarian law, the norms of state behavior, the confidence buildings, the capacity building, right? And there's 5 different pillars that we can look at here. And norms just being one of them, international humanitarian law being another. So the ambassador brought up the binding treaty. So I think maybe as our final comments, let's go down. And why don't we just start on final comments and we can go down, both on binding treaties and anything in this, on the distinction between tech and psychological and how the psychological fits in.
The challenge always in the UN context is if you can find enough common ground to actually move things into hard, legally binding obligations on states. And that is always the challenge. And the one thing in the disarmament field particularly, we found that having these two things run parallel, the soft norms where you can push on some of these things and get work done there that you cannot all agree on, but at least some states have things at a higher level that they can act on, and some states can't go there yet, so make those soft and try and agree on the hard norms. I'm not saying you're going to get a legally binding treaty. There's quite a large demand amongst those that are meeting to actually have a legally binding treaty. But there are enough facets there, like attacks on critical infrastructure and things like that, where there's some solid ground that everyone can agree on how these things apply. And I think there is at least some common ground there that can be worked on. Whether we'll achieve it at the end of the day, I'm not sure. But at least there's a much greater understanding of where to go and to try and build norms. 11 norms came out of the last GGE on responsible state behavior, and those can be built on, And these 3 of those norms cover critical infrastructure. So I think there's room in that to take this thing further. Whether we'll actually get there at the end of the day is another story. We're still young in this game, and it is a particularly challenging issue to deal with.
And let me just emphasize that when you hear someone saying there are no international norms, a group of government experts that included US, China, Russia, and others agreed to 11. So you might say they're weak. You might say they're not being, they're being ignored. That's different from they're not being there, and G20 signed up to many of those
If I
as
can
well.
add,
Oops.
and those norms were basically adopted by the General Assembly when they adopted that report. So those norms are out there.
Yep, great.
I was a bit shocked when I was in law school to learn that the average amount of time that it takes in the UN process to go from the International Law Commission receiving a mandate to work on a topic to the adoption of a treaty was 25 years. Now that I work adjacent to the United Nations, I can kind of see how that would take that amount of time. So I mean, from our side, it's important. I've mentioned the areas that we care particularly about, including the protection of essential civilian data. We want to make sure that's protected. If we can't get an understanding that is protected in armed conflict, we think we need maybe it's possible that we might need to find some norms, some ways to protect it.
Protected from disruption or just from?
So we would say, if you have a medical record and someone goes and wipes it,
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
but
Yep,
that law, we think find data as an object and loss of functionality, including wiping it off, be covered.
Okay, great. Thanks. Ambassador.
So actually, as we already said, what we do have as a starting point, or did have, was this discussion about whether we would be having new norms at all, whether these new norms should be voluntary or legally binding. And there are a number of countries who do think that we don't need anything else, everything is there, and then the others who are saying, okay, if so, then we don't understand that well, and things like that. So I believe that we are profiling the things, that issue in two streams. One would be where we could be doing something like implementation roadmap or something like that, which is related to the existing norms and the way how they can be implemented. And then the other issue would be whether or not we need new additional norms which might be addressing issue like supply chain neutrality, like attribution, like media, private sector responsibility, and probably protection of the public core of the internet as a network as well. And then at the end, we should see whether these two streams could respond to the more responsible behavior of the states.
Great. Thank you very much. Okay, and Alex gets to wrap up, and thank you for making today possible, and finish us off with a comment, please.
The benefit of that. So something I learned a few years ago, that's a lesson that I apply in a lot of situations, is never underestimate the power of self-interest. It can be incredibly effective. And so to the discussion we're having on the current state of international norm development, the work of the, I think, ironically and aptly named open-ended working group on a 25-year timeline. No one seems to have appreciated that point so far. Greg Rattray, who's here with CIPA, has helped lead some pretty significant work around trying to get norms and getting commitments on prevent governments committing to not engage in manipulation of financial data. And that's my point on the never underestimate the power of self-interest. I think everyone here kind of likes to keep their money and not have it messed with. It's a starting point that helps the governments as well as, particularly the governments, where the Russia-China example, where there are often conflicts with certain Western countries around these cyber issues, where there's a mutual benefit and belief that allows for a starting point. So I'd leave you on that.
I told you it was going to be a good panel. I hope they have internships here, because wouldn't the students like to work these places? Hold your applause, because
we have a program for that too.
Because coming up next, we are going to continue this great afternoon with John Battelle coming up. You probably know him, or you certainly know of his work. He's co-founded a dozen different things, including co-founding Wires, the Web 2 Summit, industry standard, thestandard.com. He's now CEO and co-founder of Recount Media, political media, and just wait and you see the research that he's done with his CIPA students on transparency into data flows. It's really phenomenal work. He's been coming up next, but please help me in thanking my panel.